The morning of June 14th, 1989, arrived in Laredo, Texas, with the kind of oppressive heat that seems to press down from above, turning the air thick and difficult to breathe. By 8:30, the temperature had already climbed past 85 degrees, and the forecast promised triple digits by afternoon. The sun glared off windshields and metal fences, creating pockets of blinding light that made people squint as they moved through their morning routines. Inside a modest duplex on Zapata Street, in a neighborhood where dogs knew each other's names and neighbors tracked each other's schedules without meaning to, 28-year-old Rebecca Thornton sat cross-legged on her worn living room carpet, braiding her 5-year-old son Kyle's dark hair with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this alone for 2 years. Kyle clutched his favorite toy in both hands, a green plastic stegosaurus with yellow eyes and a distinctive broken plate on its back. The third spike from the tail missing entirely, snapped off months ago during some playground adventure he could no longer quite remember. He'd named it Spike, with the straightforward logic of a 5-year-old, and the toy went everywhere with him. To bed, to kindergarten, to the grocery store, tucked into jacket pockets and backpack compartments. Rebecca's fingers moved through his hair, creating 3 sections, weaving them together in a tight braid that would survive the chaos of outdoor play. The radio on the kitchen counter played softly, some Tejano station broadcasting a mixture of music and Spanish-language advertisements for local businesses. Through the thin walls, Rebecca could hear her neighbor, Mrs. Garza, moving around in the adjacent unit, the sound of running water and cabinet doors closing carrying through the shared wall with perfect clarity. The duplex was small but clean, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs, kitchen and living room downstairs, all of it painted in neutral beige tones that made the space feel both anonymous and safe. Rebecca had lived here for 3 years, since shortly after Kyle's father left, walking out one Tuesday morning and never coming back. No dramatic fight, no forwarded address, just absence where presence used to be. She'd learned to manage alone, learned to braid hair and fix leaky faucets and budget groceries down to the last dollar. She worked the evening shift at Laredo Printing Solutions, a small company near the industrial park that produced business cards, flyers, and promotional materials for local businesses. The pay was modest, $7.50 an hour, but the schedule allowed her to be home with Kyle during the day, take him to school, pick him up, feed him dinner before a neighbor's teenage daughter arrived to babysit during Rebecca's work hours. The morning light slanted through the window at an angle that caught dust motes floating in the air, turning them golden and visible. The living room smelled faintly of coffee and the strawberry shampoo Rebecca had used on Kyle's hair the night before. His small body was warm against her legs as she worked, and he hummed tunelessly, making his dinosaur walk along the carpet in front of him, creating some elaborate scenario involving volcanoes and rescue missions that only made sense in his 5-year-old imagination. Rebecca finished the braid and secured it with a blue elastic band, the kind sold in packs of 50 at the dollar store. She patted his shoulder. "All done, baby. Go put on your shoes." Kyle jumped up, still holding Spike, and ran toward the small closet by the front door where his sneakers lived in a jumbled pile, with Rebecca's work shoes and a pair of sandals she wore on her days off. The sneakers were light-up shoes, the kind that flashed red and blue with each step, and Kyle loved them with the intense devotion children reserve for their favorite possessions. Rebecca stood, stretching her back, feeling the familiar ache in her lower spine that came from standing all evening at the printing press. She glanced at the clock on the wall, a cheap plastic thing shaped like a sunflower that had come with the duplex, and calculated the day ahead. Drop Kyle at kindergarten by 9:15. Come home and try to sleep for a few hours. Pick him up at 3. Make dinner. Wait for the babysitter. Leave for work by 5:30. The routine was so established it felt like a track her life ran on. The same pattern day after day. Not unhappy exactly, but not what she'd imagined for herself at 28. She'd wanted to go to community college, maybe study graphic design, but that dream had evaporated when she got pregnant at 23, and Kyle's father made it clear he wasn't interested in being a parent long-term. So she'd adapted. She'd learned to find satisfaction in small things. Kyle's laughter, the way he drew elaborate pictures at school, the moments of quiet in the evening when her work was done and she could sit on the small concrete patio behind the duplex and watch the stars emerge. But lately, something had shifted. A man she'd met at work 6 months ago, someone who'd seemed charming at first, attentive and interested, had begun to reveal a different side. His name was Vincent Calloway, a supervisor in the warehouse where printed materials were sorted and packaged for delivery. He'd asked her out for coffee, then dinner, and Rebecca had said yes, because it had been so long since anyone had shown interest, since she'd felt like something other than a tired single mother barely holding things together. The first few dates had been nice. He'd been polite, complimentary, easy to talk to. But gradually, small warning signs began to appear. He'd shown up at her duplex unannounced one evening. He'd asked pointed questions about where she'd been when he couldn't reach her by phone. He'd started talking about Kyle needing a father figure, about how Rebecca needed someone to take care of her. Phrases that might have sounded sweet if not for the edge underneath them, the implication that she didn't have a choice in the matter. 3 weeks ago, she'd tried to end things. She'd told him gently that she didn't think they were compatible, that she needed to focus on Kyle, that she appreciated the time they'd spent together but wanted to remain just friends. Vincent had smiled, nodded, said he understood. But the next day he'd been at her duplex again, standing on the small porch when she came home from dropping Kyle at school. He'd let himself into the fenced yard somehow, and was waiting like he belonged there. He'd told her she was confused, that she didn't really mean what she'd said, that they were good together and she'd realize it eventually. Rebecca had felt her stomach turn to ice, recognizing in that moment that this wasn't going to be simple. She'd started documenting things, writing down dates and times when he appeared uninvited, keeping a small notebook hidden in her bedroom. She'd thought about going to the police but wasn't sure what she'd say. He hadn't threatened her explicitly. He hadn't hit her. He'd just become omnipresent in a way that felt suffocating and wrong. Her sister Christine had told her to get a restraining order, but Rebecca worried that would escalate things, make him angrier. She'd been trying to handle it quietly, avoiding him at work, taking different routes home, hoping he'd lose interest. Last night, he'd called her landline. She didn't know how he'd gotten the number, and told her he needed to talk to her. He'd said he was coming by in the morning. Rebecca had told him not to, had said she wouldn't be home, but he'd laughed like she'd made a joke and hung up. She'd lain awake most of the night, listening to every sound outside, wondering if he was out there watching her windows. By morning, she'd been exhausted and frightened in a way that made her hands shake when she poured Kyle's cereal. Kyle returned from the closet with one shoe on and one shoe in his hand, hopping on his sneakered foot. "Mom, can Spike come to school today?" Rebecca crouched down to help him with the second shoe. "Sure, baby. But you have to keep him in your cubby during class time, okay? Mrs. Patterson doesn't like toys at the tables." "I know," Kyle said seriously, as if this were an important rule he'd committed to memory. He shoved Spike into his small backpack, the dinosaur's head and tail sticking out of the unzipped top. Rebecca zipped it partially, leaving enough room for the toy to breathe, which Kyle insisted was necessary, even though she'd explained multiple times that plastic didn't need air. They were getting ready to leave when someone knocked on the door. 3 sharp raps that made Rebecca's heart jump into her throat. She moved to the window, pulled the curtain aside slightly, and felt everything inside her go cold. Vincent stood on the porch, wearing jeans and a work shirt even though his shift didn't start until afternoon. He saw her looking and waved, a casual gesture that might have seemed friendly if she couldn't see his expression, the set of his jaw that said he wasn't here for a friendly conversation. Rebecca stepped back from the window, mind racing. Kyle was putting his backpack on, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. She could pretend she wasn't home, but her car was visible in the driveway, and he'd already seen her at the window. She could call the police, but what would she say? A man she dated was at her door? That wasn't a crime. She moved to the door but didn't open it, spoke through the wood. "Vincent, I'm about to take Kyle to school. This isn't a good time." "Just need 5 minutes, Rebecca. Open up." His voice was pleasant but firm, the tone of someone used to getting what they wanted. "I told you last night I didn't want to talk. And I told you we need to. Open the door or I'll just wait here until you come out. Either way, we're having this conversation." Rebecca glanced at Kyle, who had stopped moving and was watching her with the intuitive awareness children have when adults are scared. She didn't want him to see this, didn't want him to learn that men sometimes don't take no for an answer. She opened the door but positioned herself in the doorway, blocking Vincent's view of the interior, blocking any path inside. He smiled at her, that charming smile that had attracted her initially and now made her skin crawl. "See? That wasn't so hard." Can I come in? No, say what you need to say. His smile didn't fade, but his eyes changed, became harder. You're being stubborn about this, Rebecca. I'm trying to be part of your life, part of Kyle's life. The kid needs a father. You need someone. I don't understand why you're fighting this. Because I don't want it. I've told you that. You don't know what you want. You're tired, you're stressed, you're not thinking clearly. That's why you need someone to take care of you. The words might have sounded caring, but the delivery was all wrong. Each sentence dropping like a stone, heavy with implication. Rebecca felt her chest tighten. I need you to leave now. Vincent leaned against the doorframe, making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop playing games. We're going to be together. I'm going to move in here, or you're going to move in with me. We're going to be a family, whether you figured that out yet or not. And if you keep resisting, if you keep trying to push me away, things are going to get complicated for you. Understand? Rebecca understood perfectly. She understood that this man was dangerous, that his obsession had crossed into something darker, that she and Kyle were not safe while he was fixated on them. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. I'm going to take Kyle to school now. I want you to leave my property. He straightened, looked past her into the duplex where Kyle stood frozen by the coffee table. Vincent smiled at the boy, waved. Hey there, champ. Taking care of your mom? Kyle didn't respond, just stared. Vincent turned his attention back to Rebecca. Think about what I said. I'll check in later. He walked off the porch, got into his truck parked across the street, and drove away slowly, taking his time, making his point. Rebecca closed the door, locked it, stood with her back against it, breathing hard. Kyle was crying silently, tears running down his face. She went to him, pulled him into her arms. It's okay, baby. Everything's okay. But it wasn't okay. She knew with absolute certainty that Vincent wasn't going to stop. He was going to keep coming back, keep pushing, keep escalating until something terrible happened. And the authorities wouldn't help her until after he'd done something, until after she and Kyle were already hurt. She couldn't wait for that. She had to act now. The decision crystallized in her mind with frightening speed. They had to leave. Not later. Not after she made a plan and saved money and arranged things properly. Right now. Immediately. Before Vincent came back. Before he did whatever he was planning to do. She had maybe hours. Maybe less. If you're watching this from somewhere Rebecca once called home, or if you've ever faced an impossible choice between staying and running, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. These stories remind us that ordinary people sometimes have to make extraordinary decisions to survive. Rebecca moved quickly. She grabbed a duffel bag from the upstairs closet and threw clothes into it. Jeans, shirts, underwear, enough for a few days. She grabbed Kyle's clothes, his toothbrush, her toothbrush, a family photo from her nightstand. Her mind was racing, trying to think what they'd need. Money. She had $17 in her wallet and maybe $40 in a coffee can in the kitchen. Emergency money she'd been saving for car repairs. She grabbed it all. Important documents. Where were Kyle's birth certificate and her own? She found them in a folder in her bedroom closet, grabbed her social security card, Kyle's immunization records. She was operating on pure adrenaline now, not thinking clearly, but moving with purpose. Kyle stood in the living room, still crying softly, clutching his backpack. Mom, what's happening? We're going on a trip, baby. A surprise trip. Where are we going? Somewhere safe, somewhere fun. But we have to go right now. She took his hand, grabbed the duffel bag, grabbed her car keys from the counter. Then she stopped. Her car. Vincent knew her car, knew her license plate. If he was looking for her, he'd find it immediately. She put the keys down. They'd have to leave the car. They'd have to find another way. She went out the back door instead of the front, pulling Kyle with her, moving quickly through the small backyard to the alley that ran behind the row of duplexes. The alley was dusty and smelled like garbage from the bins lined up along it. Rebecca turned left, walking quickly, Kyle struggling to keep up. They emerged onto a side street 3 blocks from her duplex. She flagged down a city bus, paid with change, took seats in the back. Kyle pressed against her side, his backpack between his feet, Spike's green plastic head visible at the top. "Mom, I don't want to go. I want to go home." "I know, baby. I know. But we can't right now. We just have to trust each other, okay?" The bus took them downtown. Rebecca's plan, such as it was, involved going to her sister Christine's house. Christine lived on the north side of Laredo, had a spare bedroom, would take them in while Rebecca figured out what to do next. But as the bus neared Christine's neighborhood, Rebecca saw Vincent's truck parked on the street near her sister's house. He was watching Christine's place, waiting for Rebecca to show up there. Of course he was. That would be the first place she'd go. He'd thought ahead. Rebecca stayed on the bus, rode it to the end of the line, a grocery store parking lot on the south side of town. She got off with Kyle, stood in the parking lot in the growing heat, trying to think. She couldn't go to Christine's. She couldn't go home. She couldn't use her car. She couldn't go to the police because what would she tell them? A man had knocked on her door and talked to her. She had no bruises, no evidence, just fear that they'd tell her wasn't sufficient. She walked to a payphone outside the grocery store, considered calling Christine, but what would she say? And if Vincent had somehow gotten her home number, might he have access to Christine's too? Could he be monitoring calls somehow? Rebecca didn't know what he was capable of, and that uncertainty paralyzed her. She stood by that payphone for 20 minutes, holding Kyle's hand, watching cars come and go from the grocery store parking lot. A truck pulled up, an older man in a cap hauling produce to San Antonio. He was loading crates, moving slowly in the heat. Rebecca approached him, asked if he was heading out of town. He said yes, San Antonio, leaving in 5 minutes. She asked if he could give her and her son a ride. He looked at her skeptically, this woman with a duffel bag and a frightened child, but something in her face must have convinced him because he nodded and told them to get in. They rode in silence for 2 hours, the truck's air conditioning broken, the heat pressing in through the windows. Kyle fell asleep against her side, exhausted from crying and confusion. Rebecca stared out at the flat Texas landscape rolling past, scrub brush and fence posts and distant oil derricks pumping in fields. She was thinking about the things she'd left behind. Her purse on the kitchen counter, her wallet with her ID, her driver's license photo where she looked younger and hopeful, the breakfast dishes in the sink that would sit there for days, weeks, until her landlord eventually came to check on her. Her job at the printing company, gone without notice or explanation. Her sister Christine, who would come by the duplex when Rebecca didn't answer her calls, who would find the door unlocked and everything abandoned, who would call the police and report her sister and nephew missing. And Spike. Kyle's green stegosaurus with the broken plate. She glanced down at his backpack and saw it was unzipped. Saw the backpack was empty except for Kyle's light jacket. The dinosaur wasn't there. He must have left it in her car when they'd initially gotten ready to leave, when she'd had them gather things quickly. It was sitting in the Ford Escort parked in her driveway, the car she'd left behind because Vincent knew it. Kyle would be devastated when he realized. That toy had been his comfort object, his constant companion, and now it was gone, along with everything else from their old life. The truck driver dropped them at a bus station in San Antonio. Rebecca thanked him, took Kyle's hand, went inside the station that smelled like diesel and floor cleaner. She bought 2 tickets to Albuquerque, New Mexico, paying in 1s and quarters from her coffee can emergency fund. The clerk looked at her strangely. This woman buying tickets with loose change, a crying child at her side, but she processed the transaction without comment and handed over the tickets. They boarded a Greyhound bus that afternoon, sat in the back, and Kyle finally asked the question Rebecca had been dreading. "Mom, where's Spike?" Rebecca felt her throat close up. She'd taken her son from his home, his school, his life, and he'd lost his favorite toy in the process. "I'm sorry, baby. I think we left him in the car. I'll get you a new one, I promise. But I want Spike. He's my friend." "I know. I'm so sorry." Kyle cried himself to sleep, his head on her lap, as the bus rolled north and west out of Texas. Rebecca stared out the window, watching the landscape change, watching everything familiar disappear behind her. She'd made a choice. She'd chosen to run rather than risk staying. She'd chosen safety over stability. And now she had to live with the consequences, had to figure out how to survive with no money, no identification, no plan beyond getting as far from Vincent Calloway as possible. The disappearance made news within 48 hours. Christine had come to Rebecca's duplex when her sister didn't answer phone calls, had found the door unlocked, the breakfast dishes still in the sink, Rebecca's purse on the counter, the car in the driveway. She'd called the police immediately, her voice shaking as she reported her sister and nephew missing. Laredo Police Department responded quickly, treating it as a potential abduction given the abandoned purse and the fact that Rebecca hadn't shown up for work. Detectives came to the duplex, photographed everything, interviewed neighbors, established a timeline. Mrs. Garza, the neighbor in the adjacent unit, remembered seeing Rebecca that morning braiding Kyle's hair. She remembered hearing them moving around, the usual sounds of morning routine. She thought she'd heard a man's voice around 9 o'clock, someone at the front door, but she couldn't be certain and hadn't seen who it was. Another neighbor, Mr. Herrera, 3 houses down, recalled seeing a truck parked across the street that morning, a dark blue Chevy. But he didn't know who it belonged to, and hadn't thought much of it at the time. Rebecca's car was processed for evidence. Detectives found her keys in the ignition, found Kyle's green plastic dinosaur on the passenger seat, found nothing that suggested violence or struggle. The car was clean, ordinary, abandoned. They ran prints, found only Rebecca's and Kyle's, no one else's. They interviewed Rebecca's co-workers at the printing company. The manager said she'd been a reliable employee, quiet but competent, always on time, never caused problems. Her colleagues described her as friendly but private, someone who didn't share much about her personal life. One co-worker mentioned she'd been dating someone, a supervisor named Vincent Calloway, but that it had ended recently. Detectives brought Vincent in for questioning. He sat in the interview room relaxed and cooperative, answered every question calmly. Yes, he'd dated Rebecca briefly. Yes, she'd ended things about a month ago. No, he didn't have any hard feelings about it. No, he hadn't seen her the day she disappeared. Where had he been that morning? Home, sleeping, since his shift didn't start until 2. Could anyone confirm that? He lived alone, so no. But he had no reason to lie. Did he have any idea where Rebecca might have gone? None whatsoever. Was he worried about her? Of course, but Rebecca was an adult, and maybe she just needed to get away for a while. People do that sometimes. His truck matched the description of the vehicle seen on Rebecca's street, but dozens of men in Laredo drove dark blue Chevy trucks. There was no evidence placing him at her duplex, no witnesses who could definitively identify him there, no physical evidence connecting him to her disappearance. The detectives let him go, frustrated but unable to hold him on suspicion alone. Christine became the driving force behind the search. She organized volunteer search parties that combed through parks and vacant lots and the areas along the Rio Grande. She made hundreds of flyers with Rebecca's and Kyle's photos, distributed them to every business in Laredo, sent them to police departments in surrounding counties. She called hospitals and shelters, checked with bus stations and train depots. A clerk at the San Antonio Greyhound station thought she might have seen Rebecca, a woman paying for tickets and change with a crying child, but she wasn't certain, and the date she remembered didn't quite match. The police coordinated with Border Patrol, concerned the case might involve abduction across the international border into Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. They checked with contacts in Mexican law enforcement, distributed information about the missing pair, found nothing. Rebecca's bank account remained untouched. She'd had $83 in checking when she disappeared. That money stayed there, unclaimed, gradually eroded by monthly service fees until the account was eventually closed. The investigation documented every detail of Rebecca's life. She'd paid rent on time, 14 days before the disappearance. She'd called her sister the evening before. A normal conversation about Kyle's upcoming birthday. Nothing unusual. She'd bought groceries 4 days earlier. Milk, bread, chicken breasts, a box of orange popsicles Kyle loved. Standard purchases for a mother and child. There were no large cash withdrawals, no suspicious activity, no paper trail that suggested she'd been planning to leave. Detectives constructed a timeline precise to the quarter hour. Mail delivery at 10:15 a.m. on June 14th. Neighbor heard voices at approximately 9 a.m. Rebecca's shift at work started at 5:30 p.m., and she never arrived. Somewhere in that 7.5-hour window, Rebecca and Kyle had vanished from their lives in Laredo. The car was found 3 days later in the grocery store parking lot on the south side. Keys in the ignition, doors locked, Kyle's dinosaur on the seat. How it had gotten there, who had driven it, whether Rebecca or someone else, remained unanswered. The case attracted media attention. Local news ran stories about the missing mother and child. Someone set up a tip line. Calls came in from people who thought they'd seen Rebecca at a gas station in Corpus Christi, at a hotel in El Paso, at a rest stop outside Dallas. Each lead was investigated, and each one evaporated into nothing. Vincent Calloway was interviewed multiple times, but his story never changed, and there was never enough evidence to arrest him. He continued working at the printing company for another year before moving to Oklahoma, disappearing from the investigation's radar. Weeks became months. The active search parties dwindled as volunteers returned to their own lives. The flyers faded in shop windows, covered over by newer announcements and advertisements. The case remained open, but resources shifted to newer emergencies, more recent disappearances. Detective Luis Barajas, the primary investigator, kept Rebecca's file on his desk, reviewed it weekly, but found nothing new. He interviewed Christine monthly, updating her on the lack of progress, watching her age rapidly under the weight of not knowing. Christine's life became defined by absence. She quit her job as a receptionist at a dental office to focus on searching, burning through her savings in 6 months. She hired a private investigator, a former Houston cop named Frank Morrison, who worked the case for 8 months before the retainer ran out, and she couldn't afford to pay him anymore. He'd been thorough and professional, and found absolutely nothing. Christine went back to work, took evening shifts at a restaurant where she could make tips, saved every dollar she could. The financial cost of searching was brutal and constant. Gas money to drive to other cities following leads, photocopying costs for more flyers, private investigator fees, phone bills from calling police departments and shelters and hospitals across Texas and neighboring states. Christine borrowed money from friends, maxed out credit cards, eventually declared bankruptcy in 1992. Her husband left her in 1993, tired of living with a woman who could think of nothing but her missing sister. Christine barely noticed his departure. Her entire world narrowed to a single question: where are they? She kept a calendar on her kitchen wall marking milestones Kyle was missing. His 6th birthday should have been June 19, 1989. First day of first grade should have been August 1990. His 7th birthday. His 8th. Christine bought presents each year, wrapped them, stored them in a growing pile in her closet. A toy train set for 6. A baseball glove for 8. Books and puzzles and games Kyle would never play. She couldn't stop herself from buying them. Couldn't accept that he might never receive them. Christmas 1989 was unbearable. Christine bought a small tree, decorated it, placed wrapped presents underneath for Rebecca and Kyle. She sat alone on Christmas morning staring at those gifts, drinking coffee that went cold in her cup. Her neighbor found her there at noon, still in her pajamas, still staring, and gently helped her put the tree away. The wrapped presents went into the closet with the birthday gifts, a museum of missing time. Rebecca's belongings from the duplex remained in Christine's garage for years. The landlord had boxed everything up after 3 months of unpaid rent, and Christine had claimed it all. Boxes of clothes and kitchen items, and Kyle's toys, and Rebecca's books. Christine couldn't bring herself to open most of the boxes, couldn't face the physical evidence of lives interrupted. They sat in her garage accumulating dust, another monument to waiting. The investigation cycled through several detectives as years passed. Detective Barajas retired in 1995, handing the case file to Detective Angela Rivera, who reviewed everything with fresh eyes, and found nothing new to pursue. Rivera retired in 2003, passing the file to Detective Tom Bradley, who digitized the paper files and entered information into new databases that were gradually coming online. Bradley worked the case for 7 years, periodically calling Christine with updates that were really non-updates, keeping the case technically active. By the late 1990s, advances in DNA technology were revolutionizing cold cases, but Rebecca and Kyle's disappearance had no DNA to test. There was no crime scene, no evidence of violence, no biological samples that needed analysis. The new technology that was solving murders and abductions couldn't help with a case where a mother and child had seemingly walked out of their lives voluntarily. The case file grew thick with dead ends, false sightings, and the accumulated documentation of 7 years of fruitless searching. Christine aged and fast-forward, stress etching deep lines into her face, turning her dark hair gray by her early 40s. People told her she needed to accept that Rebecca and Kyle were gone, that she needed to move on with her life. But how do you move on when you don't know? If they were dead, she could grieve. If they were being held somewhere, she could keep searching. But the not knowing created a suspended state, a limbo where Christine existed but didn't quite live. She remarried in 1996, a patient man named Robert who'd lost his own brother years earlier and understood grief's long shadow. He didn't try to stop Christine from searching, just provided stability and support as she continued her mission. They moved to San Antonio in 1998, a fresh start in a new city, though Christine kept maps of Texas pinned to the wall in her home office, kept adding pins where sightings had been reported, kept calling police departments. The turn of the millennium brought new hope in the form of expanding databases. The National Crime Information Center had been tracking missing persons for years, but new systems were coming online that cross-referenced information in more sophisticated ways. In 2007, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, NamUs, launched, creating a centralized repository for cases across the country. Social workers, law enforcement agencies, and medical examiners began entering historical data, building a web of information that could be searched and compared in ways impossible before. In 2010, Detective Julian Reyes joined the Laredo Police Department's Cold Case Unit, a newly formed division tasked with reviewing unsolved cases using modern technology and fresh perspectives. Reyes was 36, methodical and patient, the kind of investigator who believed every case was solvable with enough time and the right approach. He drew the assignment of reviewing disappearances from the 1980s and 1990s, a stack of file boxes that represented hundreds of hours of work. Rebecca and Kyle's case caught his attention immediately. A mother and child vanishing simultaneously, no evidence of violence, an abandoned car with keys in the ignition. It didn't fit typical patterns. Most family disappearances involved custody disputes or domestic violence. But Kyle's father had been located and cleared, and Rebecca had no other romantic entanglements except Vincent Calloway, who'd been investigated thoroughly without producing evidence. Reyes started from scratch, reading every page of the file, every interview transcript, every tip sheet. He found something previous detectives had noted but not fully pursued. In the phone call transcript from the evening of June 13, 1989, Rebecca had mentioned to Christine that someone was stopping by the next morning to discuss something. Christine, interviewed multiple times over the years, had forgotten this detail, her memory of that final conversation eroded by trauma and time. But there it was in the original transcript, preserved in the initial case file. Rebecca had expected a visitor the morning of her disappearance. Someone she'd made plans with, someone she'd agreed to see. Reyes pulled the phone records that had been subpoenaed in 1989, examined every call made to and from Rebecca's landline in the weeks before she disappeared. Most were to Christine, a few to her workplace, 2 to Kyle's kindergarten. But there was one outgoing call 3 days before the disappearance, lasting 6 minutes, to a number registered to Vincent Calloway's landline. Rebecca had called him, or he'd called her, and they'd talked. The records didn't show who initiated the call. Reyes tried to locate Vincent Calloway. DMV records showed he'd moved to Oklahoma City in 1990, had held various jobs in warehouse management and shipping logistics, had married in 1995 and divorced in 2001. Reyes made contact by phone, explained he was reviewing cold cases, asked if Vincent remembered Rebecca Thornton. Vincent's voice over the phone was pleasant, cooperative, unchanged from the 1989 interview transcripts Reyes had read. Yes, he remembered her. They dated briefly. It ended. No. He didn't know what happened to her. Had he been interviewed back then? Yes, multiple times. Was he being investigated now? Reyes said no, just gathering background information. Vincent said he hoped Rebecca was found safe, hoped Reyes had better luck than the previous investigators, and ended the call politely. The conversation told Reyes nothing concrete, but confirmed his instinct that Vincent Calloway had been more involved in Rebecca's life than he admitted. But suspicion wasn't evidence, and 30-plus years had passed. Even if Vincent had done something to Rebecca and Kyle, proving it now seemed impossible without physical evidence or witnesses or some kind of confession, none of which seemed forthcoming. Meanwhile, across multiple states, a bureaucratic apparatus was grinding slowly toward an unexpected connection. The Vital Records Office in New Mexico had received federal funding to modernize and digitize historical birth certificates, death certificates, and other official documents. The project involved re-entering handwritten records from the 1960s through 1990s into a new database system, complete with error-checking protocols that compared information against Social Security records, census data, and other federal databases. In March 2021, a clerk named Patricia Hong was processing delayed birth certificates from 1984, documents filed years after actual births for various reasons. Home births without initial hospital documentation, adoptions, administrative errors. She entered information for a boy named Kyle Thornton, born November 2, 1984. Mother listed as Victoria Thornton, father listed as unknown. The system flagged a discrepancy. The Social Security number attached to this Kyle Thornton showed no employment history, no tax records, no Medicare enrollment, nothing until 1991, when suddenly Kyle Thornton appeared in public school records in Albuquerque. Patricia had been trained to investigate discrepancies, to determine whether they indicated errors or fraud, or just administrative confusion. She pulled up the Social Security Administration database, cross-referenced the number, found it had been issued in Texas in 1985. But this Kyle's birth certificate said he was born in New Mexico in 1984, and the mother's name was Victoria, not Rebecca. Patricia checked further, searching for other Kyle Thorntons born around the same time, and found dozens of entries. But when she filtered for Kyle Thorntons born in Texas in 1984, she found one other entry. Kyle Thornton, born November 2, 1984, in Laredo, Texas, mother Rebecca Thornton, last seen June 1989. Listed as missing. Patricia stared at her screen for a long moment, trying to understand what she was seeing. Same name, same birth date, same year, but different mothers, different states. The New Mexico Kyle had a Social Security number that was issued in Texas, the same number that would have been issued to the Texas Kyle if he'd gotten one in 1985. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the same person, appearing in two different places under two different identities. Patricia followed protocol, flagging the entry for supervisory review. Her supervisor, recognizing the potential significance, contacted the New Mexico Attorney General's office, who contacted the FBI's Violent Crimes Against Children Division, who entered the information into NamUs and cross-referenced it against missing children. The match came back immediately. Kyle Thornton, missing since June 14, 1989, from Laredo, Texas, might be living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, under his real name but with false documentation listing his mother as Victoria instead of Rebecca. The notification reached Detective Reyes's desk on April 5, 2022, 32 years and 10 months after Rebecca and Kyle disappeared. Reyes read the report 3 times, feeling his pulse accelerate. He pulled public records for Kyle and Victoria Thornton in Albuquerque. Kyle was now 37 years old, working as a civil engineer for a firm that designed water treatment facilities. He had a wife named Melissa and 2 daughters aged 8 and 5. He owned a home in the Northeast Heights. He had a mortgage, a credit history, a LinkedIn profile. He appeared to be living a completely normal life. Victoria Thornton was 61, living in an apartment complex near the University of New Mexico. Public records showed sporadic employment history as a house cleaner and home health aide, periods of unemployment, addresses that changed every few years. She'd never remarried, had no criminal record beyond a speeding ticket in 1993. She'd lived in New Mexico continuously since 1989. Reyes coordinated with the Albuquerque Police Department and the FBI, explaining the situation, requesting their assistance in what needed to be an extremely careful approach. You can't simply call someone and announce that their entire identity is a lie, that they've been a missing person for 3 decades without knowing it. The psychological impact could be devastating. A plan was developed. Local Albuquerque detectives and a social worker would make initial contact with Victoria, explain the situation gently, request her cooperation in verification. On April 18, 2022, Detective Maria Fuentes and social worker James Park knocked on the door of Victoria Thornton's apartment. It was a Tuesday afternoon, warm and sunny, the kind of spring day when Albuquerque's sky stretches impossibly blue. Victoria answered the door wearing jeans and a faded sweater, her gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was 61 but looked older, worn down by decades of hard work and stress. She looked at the detective and social worker with immediate wariness, the expression of someone accustomed to bad news. "Victoria Thornton?" Detective Fuentes asked. "Yes?" "I'm Detective Fuentes, Albuquerque Police Department, and this is James Park, a social worker with Family Services. We need to speak with you about some administrative matters related to your identity and your son's. May we come in?" Victoria's face went carefully neutral. "What kind of administrative matters?" "It's complicated and would be better discussed inside, if you're comfortable with that. You're not in trouble, and you're not under arrest. We just need to verify some information, and we believe this is a conversation best had privately." Victoria hesitated, then stepped aside and let them in. Her apartment was small and tidy, furnished with mismatched second-hand furniture, walls bare except for a few family photos. Detective Fuentes and James Park sat on a worn couch, while Victoria took a chair across from them, hands folded in her lap. Detective Fuentes explained as gently as possible. Records clerks in New Mexico had found discrepancies in Kyle's birth certificate. Cross-referencing against missing persons databases had revealed a match with a child who disappeared from Laredo, Texas, in 1989. A boy named Kyle Thornton, born November 2, 1984, son of Rebecca Thornton, who'd been missing for almost 33 years. They believed Victoria might be Rebecca, and Kyle might be that missing child. Victoria's expression remained carefully controlled throughout the explanation, but her hands tightened in her lap, knuckles going white. When Detective Fuentes finished, silence filled the small apartment. Finally, Victoria spoke, her voice quiet and steady. "I need to think about this. I need time." "We understand this is overwhelming," James Park said gently. "We're not here to accuse you of anything or arrest you. We just need to verify identity. Would you be willing to provide fingerprints for comparison?" "I was never fingerprinted," Victoria said. "Everyone gets fingerprinted eventually," Detective Fuentes said. "Driver's license, employment, something. The Texas DMV would have records from Rebecca Thornton's license." "I don't have a driver's license. I never learned to drive." That was almost certainly a lie. Rebecca had a license in 1989, had driven her own car. But Detective Fuentes didn't push. "Would you be willing to allow your son to be contacted? We could arrange DNA testing if you're willing to consent." "No." Victoria's voice was firm. "You leave my son out of this. He doesn't know anything about any of this. You'll destroy his life." The statement confirmed what Detective Fuentes suspected. This woman was Rebecca, and Kyle had no idea who he really was or where he'd come from. The situation was even more delicate than they'd anticipated. "Ms. Thornton, whichever name you prefer. We're trying to handle this sensitively. But a woman named Christine Foster in San Antonio has been searching for her sister and nephew for 33 years. She deserves to know they're alive. Your son deserves to know his history. We can do this with your cooperation or without it. But with your cooperation, we can make it easier on everyone." Victoria was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Come back tomorrow. Let me call my son. Let me figure out how to tell him. Give me 24 hours. Detective Fuentes agreed. They left their contact information and departed. Surveillance was established discreetly around the apartment complex, in case Victoria decided to run, but she didn't. That evening, she called the number Kyle used as his cell phone and asked him to come over the next morning. She needed to talk to him about something important. Kyle Thornton arrived at his mother's apartment at 9 a.m. the next day, confused and worried. Victoria had sounded strange on the phone, stressed in a way he hadn't heard in years. He found her sitting at her small kitchen table, coffee growing cold in front of her. She looked like she'd been awake all night. "Mom, what's going on? Are you sick?" "No. Sit down, Kyle. I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago." Kyle sat, feeling dread settle in his stomach. His mother had always been private about her past, had always deflected questions about his father, about her family, about their life before Albuquerque. He'd learned not to push, accepting the vague answers she provided. But something had changed. Victoria told him everything. She told him his real name was Kyle Thornton, which hadn't changed, but his mother's name was Rebecca, not Victoria. She told him they'd lived in Laredo, Texas until he was 5. She told him about Vincent Calloway, about the fear, about the morning she'd decided they had to run. She told him about the bus to San Antonio, the ride to Albuquerque, the forged documents, the constructed identity. She told him he had an aunt named Christine who'd never stopped looking for them. Kyle sat motionless throughout the explanation, his face going through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, shock, anger. When Victoria finished, silence stretched between them. Finally, Kyle spoke. "You're telling me my entire life is a lie. No, your life is real. I'm real. Our relationship is real. The circumstances of where we came from, those I had to change. I was a missing person. People were looking for me. There's an aunt I never met who spent 33 years searching for me. I was protecting you. From what? From my family? From knowing who I am? From him. From Vincent. I was sure he would hurt us if we stayed. I did what I thought I had to do." Kyle stood up, pacing in the small kitchen. "You could have gone to the police. You could have gotten a restraining order. You could have done something other than steal my identity and my entire history. I was terrified and 28 years old and alone. I made the best decision I could with the information I had." Detective Fuentes and James Park returned that afternoon to find both Victoria and Kyle waiting. Kyle looked shell-shocked. Victoria looked exhausted. Detective Fuentes explained the next steps: identity verification, legal documentation, notification of next of kin. She asked if they were willing to provide DNA samples for confirmation. Kyle agreed immediately. Victoria nodded slowly. The DNA testing was a formality. Kyle's age, his name, his birth date, all of it matched the missing child from Laredo. But the samples were sent to the FBI lab anyway, processed within 2 weeks. Came back confirming biological relationship between the woman calling herself Victoria and the man named Kyle. The woman calling herself Victoria was Rebecca Thornton, missing since June 14, 1989. The man was Kyle Thornton, last seen at age 5. They'd been found. Detective Reyes called Christine Foster on May 3, 2022. She was now 64, living in San Antonio with her second husband, still maintaining a small home office dedicated to Rebecca and Kyle's disappearance. She answered the phone on the second ring. "Miss Foster, this is Detective Julian Reyes with the Laredo Police Department, calling about your sister Rebecca and your nephew Kyle." Christine's breath caught. She'd gotten calls like this before, updates that went nowhere. "Yes? We've found them. They're alive. They're in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They've been there since 1989. Christine didn't speak. Couldn't speak. The words didn't make sense. "Found them alive? After 33 years? Ms. Foster, are you there? I don't understand. Found them how?" Reyes explained the vital records discrepancy, the database match, the verification. He explained that Rebecca had been living under the name Victoria, that Kyle had no memory of Texas or his first 5 years. He explained that Rebecca claimed she'd fled an abusive situation, that she'd been hiding to protect herself and her son. Christine was crying, laughing, making sounds that weren't quite words. "Can I see them? Can I talk to them?" "That's going to take some coordination. This is extremely sensitive. Kyle just learned his entire identity was constructed. Rebecca is dealing with decades of trauma and guilt. We're working with therapists to facilitate contact carefully. I want to see my sister. I've been looking for 33 years. I know. We're going to make that happen. I promise you." The first meeting was arranged for June 2022, almost exactly 33 years after the disappearance. Therapists and social workers coordinated every detail, preparing both Christine and Rebecca for a reunion that would be emotionally overwhelming for everyone involved. They chose a neutral location, a conference room in a family services building in Albuquerque. Walls painted calming blue, soft lighting, tissues on every table. Christine arrived first, drove up from San Antonio with her husband Robert. She wore a dress she'd bought specifically for this day, changed outfits 3 times that morning before settling on something that felt right. Her hands shook as she walked down the hallway toward the conference room. A therapist named Dr. Lauren Bennett met her at the door, explained what to expect, reminded her that Rebecca might look very different, that the reunion would be complicated and emotional, that there was no script for this. Rebecca arrived 15 minutes later, Kyle driving her. She'd barely slept in the weeks since the discovery, had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, looked fragile in a way that made the social workers worry. She stood outside the conference room door for a full minute, unable to make herself go inside. Kyle put his hand on her shoulder. "I'm right here if you need me. You should meet her too. She's your aunt." "One thing at a time, Mom. This is your reunion first." Rebecca walked into the room and saw Christine standing by the window, backlit by afternoon sun. For a moment, neither woman moved. 33 years collapsed into nothing. Christine saw her baby sister, older and worn but unmistakably Rebecca. Rebecca saw the sister who'd been her protector, her confidant, her best friend. They moved toward each other simultaneously, meeting in the middle of the room, embracing so tightly neither could breathe properly. They cried for 10 minutes straight, holding each other, not speaking, just crying and holding on. Dr. Bennett and the other professionals in the room stepped back, gave them space, let the moment unfold naturally. When they finally pulled apart, Christine held Rebecca's face in her hands, studying every line, every change, trying to reconcile this 61-year-old woman with the 28-year-old sister who'd vanished. "I looked for you every day," Christine said. "Every single day for 33 years. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting us. I thought he would hurt us if I stayed." Who were you running from?" "Vincent. Vincent Calloway. He worked with me. We dated briefly and he became obsessed. He threatened us. I was terrified." Christine remembered the name from police reports, the man who'd been questioned and cleared. The police investigated him. They said there was no evidence. There wasn't. That's why I ran. He was careful. He never left evidence. But I knew what he was capable of. I saw it in his eyes. The conversation continued for hours, Rebecca explaining her decisions, Christine trying to understand. There was love and anger and grief and relief all tangled together. Christine wanted to forgive her sister immediately, but also wanted Rebecca to understand the cost of her disappearance, the 33 years of searching, the financial ruin, the destroyed marriage, the endless wondering. Rebecca wanted Christine to understand her terror, but also knew nothing could justify what she'd done. Stealing Kyle's history. Stealing Christine's family. Kyle waited in another room, pacing, checking his phone obsessively, trying to process everything. When Rebecca finally emerged, exhausted and red-eyed, she told him Christine wanted to meet him. He followed her back into the conference room, this 37-year-old man meeting his aunt for the first time he could remember. Christine looked at him and saw a stranger who was somehow also family. He had Rebecca's eyes, the same shape and color. He had his father's build, tall and lean. He was older than Rebecca had been when she disappeared, a full-grown man with a career and family, and Christine had missed every moment of his growing up. She hugged him carefully, this nephew she'd searched for, and Kyle hugged back awkwardly, trying to feel something he didn't quite feel yet. "I bought you birthday presents," Christine said. "Every year. I have 33 years of presents in storage." Kyle didn't know what to say to that. The image of this woman buying gifts for a child who never received them, for years and years, was too sad to process. Thank you. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. I'm just glad you're alive." The reunification process was slow and complicated. Therapists worked with all three of them individually and together, helping them navigate the emotional minefield of their situation. Kyle struggled with identity issues, with the revelation that his mother had lied to him for 38 years. He was angry, then understanding, then angry again, cycling through emotions without resolution. His wife Melissa tried to support him, but struggled to understand how someone could discover they were a missing person at 37. Rebecca underwent intensive therapy for trauma and PTSD, finally addressing the fear that had driven her into hiding. Therapists diagnosed her with complex PTSD from domestic violence, helped her understand that her response in 1989, fleeing with her child, had been a survival instinct, not necessarily the wrong choice given her limited understanding of her options at the time. But they also helped her see the cost of her choice, the damage done by 3 decades of hiding. Christine worked with a therapist specializing in ambiguous loss, that strange grief that comes from losing someone without death. She'd spent 33 years in suspended mourning, and the relief of finding Rebecca alive was complicated by anger at being left behind. She'd lost her sister, her marriage, her financial stability, years of her life to a search that turned out to be unnecessary because Rebecca had been hiding intentionally. Forgiving that took time and work. The legal situation resolved gradually. New Mexico prosecutors reviewed Rebecca's case, examining the identity fraud and false documentation. A district attorney named Patricia Ochoa ultimately declined to prosecute, issuing a public statement that explained the extraordinary circumstances. A young mother fleeing credible fear of domestic violence, using false identity as a survival mechanism, causing no harm to individuals, only to bureaucratic systems. Pursuing charges would serve no justice purpose and would further traumatize a family already dealing with decades of consequences. Kyle's identity was legally corrected through court order. His birth certificate was amended to show his mother's correct name, Rebecca Thornton, while preserving his name and birth date. His social security records were updated and annotated. The bureaucratic untangling took months of paperwork, affidavits, court appearances, but eventually Kyle Thornton existed officially as himself, with a history that now included both his first 5 years in Texas and his subsequent life in New Mexico. Vincent Calloway was located in Oklahoma City, now 63 years old, working in warehouse management. Detective Reyes interviewed him extensively, as did FBI agents looking into potential kidnapping or custodial interference charges. Vincent maintained he'd never threatened Rebecca, that their breakup had been amicable, that he had no idea why she would have fled. Without physical evidence or witnesses or any documentation of threats, no charges could be filed. The statute of limitations on most relevant crimes had long since expired. Vincent remained free, denying everything, and Rebecca had to accept that he would face no consequences for the fear that had shaped her entire adult life. Rebecca never moved back to Texas. New Mexico was home now, the place where she'd rebuilt from nothing, the place where Kyle's children knew her as Grandma Rebecca. She found community in a domestic violence survivors group that met weekly at a community center near her apartment. She shared her story with other women who'd made desperate choices to escape danger, who understood fear that rewrites identity. The other survivors didn't judge her for the false documents or the years of hiding. They understood that survival sometimes requires extreme measures. She became an advocate, speaking at shelters and community centers about domestic violence and the importance of early intervention. She emphasized that running and hiding, while it had kept her and Kyle alive, had also stolen decades from them. Stolen Kyle's childhood memories, stolen his relationship with his aunt. She urged women facing similar situations to seek help through proper channels, shelters, legal aid, protective orders, resources that had been less robust in 1989 but were more available now. Her story became a cautionary tale about the long-term costs of disappearing. Kyle's relationship with his mother evolved slowly. The initial anger faded into something more nuanced. He understood she'd been young and terrified and trying to protect him. He couldn't condone the lies, but he could understand the fear that had motivated them. They attended family therapy together for over a year, working through the betrayal and reconstruction of trust. Some days were better than others. Some days Kyle could barely look at her. Some days he remembered all the times she'd been there for him, all the sacrifices she'd made, and felt overwhelming love despite everything. His daughters helped bridge the gap. They loved their Grandma Rebecca, and couldn't understand why Daddy was sometimes angry with her. Kyle watched his oldest daughter, now 9, interact with Rebecca, and saw the gentleness, the patience, the unconditional love his mother had always shown him. That love hadn't been a lie. Their relationship hadn't been a lie. The circumstances of their origin, those had been falsified. But the 33 years of mother and son, those were real. Christine visited Albuquerque every other month, gradually building a relationship with the sister she'd lost, and the nephew who was essentially a stranger. She brought photo albums from their childhood, showed Rebecca pictures of their parents who'd both died while Rebecca was in hiding, showed Kyle photos of himself as a baby and toddler, the years before his memory began. Kyle stared at those photos trying to recognize himself, trying to access memories that were gone forever. The sisters developed a routine during Christine's visits. Coffee every morning at Rebecca's small kitchen table, talking about everything and nothing. Christine told stories about the search, the false leads, the years of wondering. Rebecca told stories about building a life in Albuquerque, the fear that never quite left, the constant vigilance. They cried together frequently. They laughed sometimes too, finding humor in odd places, the way people do when processing trauma. Christine brought the storage unit's contents during one visit, 33 years of birthday presents. Kyle's daughters helped unwrap them, delighted by the toys meant for a child, but fascinating as artifacts of past decades. A train set from 1990. A Super Nintendo from 1995. Books and puzzles and action figures, all carefully wrapped and preserved. Kyle watched his daughters play with toys meant for him, and felt the weight of lost time physically, like pressure on his chest. Rebecca wrote a detailed account of her life in hiding, worked with a therapist to document everything for Kyle's benefit. She wanted him to understand not just what she'd done, but why. Wanted him to have the complete story, even if he never fully forgave her. The document was 50 pages long, chronicling her fear, her flight, the construction of Victoria Thornton, the years of looking over her shoulder, the guilt that never left. Kyle read it twice, cried through most of it, put it away in a drawer, took it out months later, and read it again. The case became a teaching example in multiple fields. Law enforcement agencies studying cold cases examined how the vital records discrepancy had finally connected the dots after 3 decades. Social workers and domestic violence advocates analyzed the case to understand why Rebecca hadn't felt safe using legitimate protective services. Family therapists studied the reunification process, the challenges of reconnecting after decades of separation. Psychology programs examined Kyle's experience of late-onset identity disruption, discovering in adulthood that fundamental assumptions about yourself are false. Detective Reyes received commendations from both Texas and New Mexico for solving the case, though he consistently deflected credit to the databases that made the connection possible, and to Patricia Hong, the clerk who'd noticed the discrepancy and followed protocol. He continued working cold cases, motivated by the reminder that even 3-decade-old disappearances could be solved with persistence and modern technology. Vincent Calloway died in November 2023, a heart attack at 64 while at work. Detective Reyes called Rebecca to inform her. She felt nothing at first, then relief, then a strange hollowness. She'd built him into such a monster in her mind, had let fear of him control her entire adult life, and now he was simply gone. Dead of natural causes, never having faced consequences for the threats that had driven her into hiding. His death didn't change anything for her. She'd escaped him 34 years ago. His actual death was just administrative closure. Kyle learned about Vincent's death and felt angry on his mother's behalf. This man had terrorized her into fleeing, had stolen Kyle's childhood and family connections, and had died peacefully without ever admitting what he'd done or facing justice. The unfairness of it consumed Kyle for weeks until his therapist helped him understand that Rebecca had survived, that Kyle had survived, that they'd rebuilt connection with Christine, that life had continued despite Vincent's actions. His death didn't matter nearly as much as their survival. Rebecca turned 62 in November 2024, celebrated with Kyle's family and Christine visiting from San Antonio. They had cake and presents, and Kyle's daughters sang happy birthday slightly off-key. Rebecca looked around her small apartment at her family, this patchwork of lost and found relationships, and felt grateful despite everything. She'd made terrible choices born of terror. She'd hurt people she loved. She'd stolen Kyle's history. But she'd kept him alive and safe, and he'd grown into a good man, and they still had a relationship even after he learned the truth. Some days that felt like redemption. Some days it felt like the bare minimum. Both were true. Christine retired in 2024, finally able to rest after decades of searching, and then decades of working to make up for the financial devastation the search had caused. She and Robert moved to a smaller house, downsized their life, made peace with aging. She kept one box from the storage unit, Kyle's green plastic dinosaur that had been found in Rebecca's car in 1989, preserved as evidence for years, then returned to Christine. Spike, with his broken plate, sat on Christine's mantle now, a memorial to everything lost and found. Kyle's oldest daughter, Lily, now 10 years old, asked to hear the story. Not the child-appropriate version, the real story. Kyle and Rebecca told her together, sitting in Rebecca's living room, explaining fear and choices and consequences. Lily listened carefully, asked questions, tried to understand. At the end, she hugged her grandmother and said, "I'm glad you kept my daddy safe," Rebecca cried, grateful for the simple understanding of a child who couldn't fully comprehend the complexity, but offered love anyway. The case remains technically solved, but emotionally complex in ways that bureaucratic closure can't address. The database shows Rebecca and Kyle Thornton, missing June 1989, found April 2022 status, located alive. But that simple notation can't capture 33 years of parallel lives. Christine's searching and Rebecca's hiding, Kyle's constructed childhood and his destabilized adulthood. The finding didn't restore what was lost. It gave them something different. A chance to build forward from damage, to create new relationships from fragments. For families of missing persons, Rebecca's case offers complicated hope. It proves people can survive decades and be found alive, but it also illustrates that finding doesn't mean restoration. Christine got her sister back, but not the 33 years. Kyle got his history but lost his certainty. Rebecca got to stop hiding but had to face the consequences of her choices. The happy ending was really just an opportunity to begin processing the damage, a chance to build something new rather than recover something old. Resources for domestic violence survivors have expanded dramatically since 1989. The National Domestic Violence Hotline operates 24 hours at 1-800-799-7233, offering confidential support and resources. Every state has shelters and safe houses. Legal aid organizations help with protective orders and custody issues. Identity protection programs help people relocate safely without falsifying documents. These systems aren't perfect, but they offer alternatives to complete disappearance. Rebecca's story comes from an era with fewer options, but today's survivors have paths worth exploring. For anyone watching who sees their own fear reflected in Rebecca's story, please know that you don't have to erase yourself to escape danger. Isolation is a tool of control. Connection is a tool of survival. Reach out to professionals trained in domestic violence intervention. Make a safety plan. Document everything carefully. You deserve safety without losing your identity. The path is hard, but it's better than spending decades as someone else, carrying secrets that poison everything they touch. Rebecca sits on her apartment balcony sometimes in the evenings, watching Albuquerque's sunset paint the Sandia Mountains pink and gold, and thinks about parallel lives. In one version, she stayed in Laredo and Vincent hurt them. In another, she stayed and nothing happened, and she wasted her life running from a threat that would have faded naturally. In the version that occurred, she ran and hid and survived and lost and found and became two people trying to integrate into one. She can't regret protecting Kyle, but she mourns the cost. That tension defines her now. Kyle drives across the city to visit her most Sundays. His daughters run ahead of him up the apartment stairs, bursting through the door to hug their grandmother. They know the story now in age-appropriate versions, understand that Grandma Rebecca had to hide once but doesn't have to anymore. They understand family can be complicated and still be family. They're building the memory forward that was stolen backward. Christine visits every other month still, stays a week each time. The sisters drink coffee and take walks and gradually accumulate new shared experiences to balance against the lost decades. They take photos constantly now, Christine's phone filled with images of Rebecca and Kyle and his family. She's documenting everything, making up for albums that don't exist. The pictures can't recover lost time, but they record new time, which is something. The green dinosaur sits on Christine's mantle, one broken plate visible, a memorial to June 14, 1989, the day ordinary life shattered into fragments. Kyle bought his youngest daughter an identical stegosaurus, showed her how one plate was missing just like the one he'd had as a child. She carries it everywhere now, this little girl who knows only safety and love, carrying a toy that connects her to her father's lost past. The circle closes in small ways, meaning rebuilt piece by piece. Rebecca will never fully forgive herself, and Christine will never fully understand the terror that drove her sister into hiding. Kyle will always carry the dissonance of learning his identity at 37. These truths coexist with love and effort, and the slow work of building family from damage. They're learning that resolution isn't restoration, that finding isn't the same as recovering. That reunion is really just the beginning of a different kind of work. The case file in Laredo will be preserved digitally, archived for future researchers studying missing persons and family reunification. The narrative will be simplified. Mother and child disappeared 1989, found 2022, fled domestic violence situation. The nuance, the complexity, the 33-year gap that changed everyone involved. Those details will live primarily in the people who experienced them, gradually fading as memories do. But for now they're still living it, still processing, still building. Rebecca tends a small garden on her balcony, growing herbs and flowers, something she never did while hiding because gardens suggest permanence, and she couldn't risk permanence. Kyle takes his daughters to visit Texas sometimes, shows them Laredo, the city he doesn't remember but comes from. Christine works on a book about her experience, not for publication, but for processing, needing to externalize the 3 decades of searching. They mark anniversaries now. June 14th, the disappearance day. April 18th, the day detectives knocked on Victoria's door. June 2nd, the first reunion. They don't celebrate these dates exactly, but they acknowledge them, call each other, remember. The marking creates structure for their shared history, waypoints in the complex geography of loss and recovery. The story raises questions that don't have clean answers. When does protection become harm? When does fear justify erasure? How do you balance safety against identity? How do you forgive choices that were wrong but understandable? How do you integrate a found family member who's simultaneously familiar and stranger? These questions don't resolve neatly. They remain open, worked through gradually, lived with rather than solved. Rebecca Thornton, Victoria Thornton, whoever she is depending on which name you use, survived. Kyle Thornton survived. Christine Foster survived. They all survived differently, they all carry different scars, but they survived. And now they're learning to do more than survive. They're learning to build something new from the pieces, to create meaning from chaos, to find purpose in advocacy and awareness. It's not the happy ending anyone wanted, but it's an ending that permits forward motion, which after 33 years frozen in uncertainty, feels like grace.